You owe $1,200, or I'll have the city condemn this property. The woman who insisted she was our HOA president grew bolder with every visit. My wife was on edge, but I could tell from the start that something was seriously off. Her so-called final move came when she tried to use what she claimed was her master key to barge into our home. The key didn't fit. She froze, lost her composure, and in her panic, dialed the police on us. What happened afterward turned out to be the most gratifying moment of my entire career. Let's just say karma can be unusually creative. Drop a comment if you've ever had to deal with fake authority figures. It all began on what looked like a completely normal Tuesday. I was upstairs in my office, catching up on departmental reports, hidden under my usual alias, David Carter, private security consultant. Being the police chief of a small town gave me some scheduling freedom, but it also forced me to protect my cover anytime criminal activity showed up uncomfortably close to home. I heard Becky's car roll into the driveway after a grocery trip, followed almost instantly by voices echoing from the first floor. Voices that should never have been in my house while my wife was away. Instinct took over. I moved quietly to the stair landing, ready to evaluate what sounded like an active break-in. What I saw when I glanced down into the kitchen chilled me, but not in the way Becky would have expected. A woman I had never seen before stood in our kitchen. Middle-aged, sharp bob haircut, designer-looking business suit. She was moving through our home with the confidence of ownership, snapping photos of our fixtures and appliances like she was on a professional assignment. She wasn't a random thief or confused neighbor. The precision of her actions was something I'd only ever observed in seasoned con artists running property fraud schemes. The way she slipped past our cameras, her awareness of our routines, even her comfort in navigating the house. It was obvious she'd been studying us for weeks. When Becky came through the front door with her groceries, I watched the woman immediately pivot into an official persona. She flashed a badge and confidently announced she was Mary King, president of the Riverside Meadows Homeowners Association, carrying out a safety inspection after complaints had been filed. The act was polished, persuasive, exactly the kind of scam that fools unsuspecting homeowners. But I caught every tell. Her refusal to answer directly, her habit of deflecting verification requests, and above all, her knowledge of our household details that no HOA president should ever know. I came downstairs still under the guise of David Carter, security consultant, careful not to reveal my real role in law enforcement. If Mary was part of a larger network targeting neighborhoods, one wrong move could scare her off before I had the proof I needed. My wife's very real fear and confusion gave me the perfect backdrop to quietly collect evidence without blowing my cover. Still, I hated that Becky had to be left in the dark about what we were truly facing. Mary's familiarity with things no outsider should know confirmed my suspicion this was organized crime. She knew our mail schedule, pointed out supposed blind spots in our security, and even cited violation records from before we had bought a house that sat empty for half a year. This wasn't casual fraud. This was targeted, systematic exploitation, something that required a team and careful planning. I logged every word and movement while pretending to simply be a civilian consultant dealing with surprise HOA demands. Then Brad Coleman arrived, the handyman. The timing was almost theatrical. He showed up with tools already prepped for repairs Mary claimed were urgent, all based on our bogus inspection. His body language screamed unease. He looked at me like he sensed something wasn't right, though he couldn't place what. His discomfort told me he knew I wasn't just another homeowner, but he couldn't prove it. Mary's demand for $500 in violation penalties for renovations we never made was pure extortion. But the fake documents, the tone of authority, and the air of legitimacy made it a trap most families would fall into. I saw Becky agonize over whether to pay, and though it tore me to watch, her distress helped reinforce my cover while I cataloged every criminal tactic in play. The point that nailed down the true scope of their scheme came as Mary prepared to leave with the cash, a payment I intentionally let Becky make so I could maintain my cover. She looked over her shoulder and, with a smirk, said, "Oh, and Mrs. Thompson, maybe tell your husband to update his garage code. 2847 is too obvious. Same as his April birthday, right?" That comment revealed just how deep their surveillance went. The next day, I gently nudged Becky to ask questions around the neighborhood while I worked behind the scenes with my department to dig into Mary King and her supposed crew. Watching my wife uncover piece by piece how vast Mary's fraud ring was made me both proud and frustrated. Proud, because Becky was a natural investigator. Frustrated, because I couldn't break cover even as her findings confirmed everything I feared. Her conversations with neighbors exposed a full pattern of abuse. Mrs. Garcia had been conned out of $300 for fake fire hazard citations. Mr. Johnson had lost $800 to imaginary structural emergencies. Every story was nearly identical. Pressure, intimidation, and financial exploitation executed with the same professional tactics. Becky's discoveries confirmed that this wasn't neighborhood drama. It was organized, deliberate criminal enterprise. Tactics meant to force compliance by manufacturing urgency and projecting authority. Mary's choice of targets showed a level of criminal tradecraft. She deliberately went after women who were home alone in daylight, steered clear of houses with an obvious male presence, and had clearly researched family timetables and routines before approaching potential victims. My pattern analysis, conducted through official channels while I kept my civilian persona, made clear this exceeded simple neighborhood grifting. Mary King had no legitimate ties to any HOA in our county. Her claimed authority was entirely fake, and the paperwork she handed victims bore signs of professional forgery that pointed toward organized fraud rings. This wasn't a one-off scam exploiting suburban goodwill. This was a coordinated criminal enterprise that required accomplices, skilled intelligence gathering, and cross-jurisdictional coordination. When Becky pointed out a mismatch on my business card signatures, I had to think on my feet to preserve operational security while addressing her growing doubts about inconsistencies in my consulting identity. The David Carter cover was essential to the investigation, but explaining why my materials showed different names demanded delicate misdirection I hated using on my own wife. Every small falsehood I kept up to protect the case made me feel worse about keeping her in the dark. Yet revealing my badge too soon would have blown the operation and let Mary's network vanish. Mary escalated with glossy, seal-stamped PDFs and printed door hangers. No real inspectors, just theatrics. The forgeries were slick, but they carried enough technical errors to demonstrate intent and support charges for conspiracy, fraud, and extortion. Becky grabbed some of the dropped paperwork and noticed telltale slips, zipper typos, misspelled names, shaky signatures. Under pressure, Mary was leaving a trace. We could map to other victims. Mrs. Kim's note about Brad duplicating keys at the local hardware store supplied a crucial corroborating lead. His extra keys for safety story was the same kind of cover professional thieves use, and his nervousness around me suggested he recognized law enforcement behavior, even when disguised. His key-making would later underpin breaking and entering counts. More alarmingly, it showed Mary's crew was preparing to escalate beyond fraud and extortion. When Becky suggested we verify the HOA's registration, Mary immediately tried to block any checks. Exactly the reaction criminals give when the con is threatened. Meanwhile, my official database queries began to flag prior fraud arrests for Mary in multiple states, a burglary record for Brad, and ties pointing to an interstate crew. We logged everything, threats, documents, timestamps, quietly building a watertight case while keeping my public profile low. Then I found Mary's notebook tucked behind our mailbox, and the situation crystallized. Page after page listed neighbors' personal details, work shifts, family routines, and even planned vacations. The final note about our house made clear how close we'd been to real danger. Security consultant husband, verify. Background immediately. Mary's decision to bring faux municipal officials to our doorstep was the tactical mistake I'd been waiting for. It created multiple witnesses and fed evidence for conspiracy and interstate fraud charges. The man she introduced as Inspector Williams was another network member, but his jittery manner and lack of confidence made him the weak link I could exploit. His credentials were amateurish compared with Mary's, and his inability to answer routine municipal questions would be textbook proof of impersonation. From a law enforcement perspective, the whole inspection was a crude stage act, but I still had to play the civilian to collect prosecutable details. Their staged discovery of a tampered handrail, something Brad had clearly loosened on a prior visit, showed premeditation and conspiratorial planning that would support enhanced charges at trial. The $1,200 emergency repairs demand was a clear escalation. Evidence Mary was sinking into riskier criminal choices. When I politely asked Inspector Williams for his license number for insurance purposes, I applied standard investigative interview techniques while preserving my security consultant cover. The result was immediate and devastating for them. Williams fumbled excuses, exposed his lack of legitimate authority, and beat a hasty retreat, creating demonstrable evidence of criminal intent that would be hard for any defense to dismiss. Mary's failure to control her accomplice's panic revealed a lack of operational discipline in her network. My choice to press Brad directly while protecting my cover required calibrated psychological pressure to extract information without exposing my law enforcement role. The interview methods I'd honed over decades worked even under a civilian guise, and Brad's quick admissions laid bare the breadth of Mary's operation beyond my initial hopes. He confessed Mary was paying him $200 a house to fabricate violations, precisely the sort of testimony that supports organized crime indictments. Worse, Brad revealed Mary's mounting gambling debts and links to loan sharks, shifting the case from property fraud to a possible violent crime nexus and triggering the need to involve organized crime units and federal partners. Her dangerous creditors explained Mary's growing recklessness, and suddenly our neighborhood probe connected to far more menacing criminal networks than I'd first realized. The safety of my family and neighbors demanded immediate tactical changes in how I handled the investigation. The psychological pressure I applied during Brad's interrogation was structured to leverage his palpable fear of Mary's criminal contacts and fear of legal consequences for taking part in a coordinated fraud scheme. But he cooperated far more than I expected, and his testimony produced intelligence that would protect other neighborhoods from the same operation. He gave a granular account of Mary's victim selection process, her surveillance techniques, and the roster of accomplices she relied on, precisely the kind of detailed witness statement federal prosecutors need to pursue racketeering-style cases against organized fraud rings. Instead of fading away when her scheme unraveled, Mary lashed out with threats, a reaction that signaled either sloppy criminal judgment or dangerous desperation that could put my family at risk. She warned she'd accuse us of harassment and bring actual city officials to handle our interference. Bluster that was legally empty but revealing about her state of mind and misunderstanding of how exposed she'd become. A clever operator would have cut and run once control was lost. Mary's persistence suggested either inexperience or a reckless refusal to admit defeat. Coordinating background checks and forensic analysis while I pretended to be a civilian consultant required tight, discreet communication with my department, so we didn't compromise operational security. What surfaced from those inquiries made it clear federal involvement was necessary. Mary's record included arrests for fraud in multiple states. Brad had a burglary conviction, and links began pointing to an interstate crew. Desperation invited mistakes, and with loan shark pressure in the picture, we immediately arranged witness protection measures and tightened our net. The moment Mary's network exposed my real career was the tactical inflection point I'd feared and anticipated. It turned a controlled evidence-gathering operation into a direct confrontation that demanded everything I'd learned in the job to manage safely. Her access to details about my police past showed the criminal resources at her disposal. Her decision to reveal that knowledge suggested either dangerous overconfidence or sheer panic. Just when we thought we were steering things, her phone buzzed with information about me. She read it aloud, growing smug as she announced, "Chief Benjamin Thompson, badge 4782. Your wife doesn't know, does she? Tell me in the comments. Have you ever had to hide your real job to keep your family safe? What would you do if criminals discovered your identity?" When Mary named my badge number and retirement date, It clicked that this case had gone well past neighborhood fraud and into territory that could endanger my family, forcing immediate choices about operational security and witness safety that I'd hoped to avoid. Becky's face when Mary recited those details made clear my cover story was over. But laying bare my role as police chief could have worsened the danger and jeopardized the federal investigation we were building. Becky's confrontation about my secrecy was inevitable and deserved. Explaining my security-driven deceptions without blowing critical investigations required a painful balancing act between marital honesty and law enforcement confidentiality. Her anger at being left out of the loop was justified, yet her genuine reactions have been a key component in keeping Mary's crew talking until we had enough evidence to act. When Becky found sealed evidence bags, forensic kits, and encrypted communications gear in my home office, it revealed the scale of the investigative work I'd been doing with agencies pursuing organized crime. But I couldn't detail why a neighborhood harassment case had escalated into something requiring specialized federal resources without risking broader prosecutions. I told Becky how my suspicion that Mary was an organized operator began the moment she stepped into our kitchen, to justify why I'd treated the episode as a serious criminal investigation rather than mere petty harassment. But admitting that also exposed how much operational security had intruded on our marriage, something I never wanted to impose on her. My training had instantly flagged Mary's behavior as systematic and coordinated, not the random actions of an irate neighbor. Yet proving that required undercover evidence gathering that couldn't be done openly. I explained as best I could why Becky's authentic fear and confusion were invaluable to the case. Her responses created a believable context that prevented Mary from suspecting an inside investigation and allowed federal partners to trace the operation's scope across state lines. The phone calls Becky overheard were part of coordinated efforts by multi-state task forces tracking Mary's network, details I could not share without risking other investigations. Bringing in an outside consultant would have instantly exposed my active ties with federal agencies that handle multi-state crime investigations. Ironically, stepping away from day-to-day police work had only widened my involvement in high-level cases needing coordination between different federal branches. Mary showing up in our neighborhood wasn't random. It triggered the very fraud detection protocols I had once helped design for organized crime investigations. Becky's anger at realizing she had unknowingly been part of a federal sting was absolutely fair. But the alternative would have been pulling my family out of our own home, while agencies launched an obvious probe, one that would have tipped Mary's associates off and allowed them to vanish before charges could ever be filed. A criminal network this large couldn't be half investigated. Anything less than full prosecution would simply push the problem into other neighborhoods, leaving dangerous predators free to keep preying on families nationwide. Trying to mend my marriage while guarding operational security showed the painful balance my consulting demanded, protecting families at the cost of my own. Becky's trust mattered, but exposing the full picture of my federal work could have put her directly in the crosshairs of criminals who had already proven they weren't afraid to target law enforcement families. The tools and strategies I deployed came from decades of training and consulting at the highest levels. Yet Mary's scheme wasn't simple property fraud. It carried the markings of interstate organized crime, requiring agencies that specialize in dismantling professional networks. My ability to recognize seasoned criminal behavior, access restricted databases, and coordinate multiple agencies wasn't ordinary policing. It was the kind of expertise only forged in federal-level cases. Rebuilding trust at home was complicated by the secrecy surrounding those investigations. I couldn't reveal everything, not without jeopardizing Becky's safety. But our family's long-term security depended on dismantling Mary's entire network, not just catching her and a few allies. Yes, the strain on our marriage was real, but temporary compared to the lasting safety that came from shutting down an interstate criminal operation. Keeping my cover as a civilian consultant while coordinating with federal agencies had been the only way to collect airtight evidence for prosecution. And now, that work meant Mary's crew was about to meet the full weight of federal law enforcement, Protection not just for us, but for communities across state lines. The personal toll of that secrecy was steep. But the alternative was far worse, letting criminals keep hunting families while slipping through cracks between jurisdictions. That night, I couldn't sleep. At midnight, I finally made the call that ended my cover. "Ryan, this is Chief Thompson. I need backup for a sting tomorrow night. The suspect's armed, desperate. This isn't just fraud anymore." My cover was finished. By tomorrow, Mary would find out who she was really dealing with. The morning of the showdown, I activated security protocols I'd never imagined using inside my own house. I reshaped the entryways into what we call a tactical funnel. Easy to get in, nearly impossible to get out until backup arrived. The lock modifications I made to exits and back doors came from years of field experience. But reinforcing my own home like a trap was a brutal reminder of how dangerous undercover work becomes when it collides with your personal life. Partnering with Officer Ryan Mitchell shifted everything from covert surveillance to a live operation. I had to brief him on Mary's network and the interstate fraud charges uncovered by months of investigation. Ryan grasped the tactical stakes instantly, backing me without hesitation, a trust built through years of leadership. Still, dragging my department into what had started as a neighborhood feud was the escalation I'd fought to avoid. Brad's cooperation revealed Mary's last, most reckless move, breaking into our home to stage electrical hazards disguised as code violations. The plan wasn't just fraud, it created real fire threats that could have killed my family. That level of criminal planning turned a scam into potential homicide, requiring urgent federal coordination. I outfitted the house with advanced surveillance, gear I'd perfected through decades of training. Every angle, every mic, every safeguard in place to guarantee prosecutors airtight evidence admissible across multiple jurisdictions. Brad's role as the insider letting Mary in was part of a controlled sting, overseen with legal precision to avoid entrapment or constitutional missteps. His shaky agreement showed both regret and real fear of the federal charges hanging over him. Brad never fully cooperated with our sting. So when Mary showed up right at 11 p.m., carrying a bag stuffed with electrical gear meant to rig our house with fire hazards, I was already stationed in my command post. Eyes on every camera feed, coordinating with Ryan, and staying linked to the federal teams monitoring this interstate network. The way she strode toward our home radiated experience. This wasn't some petty HOA scam. The tools she carried were high-grade, the kind you'd only get with backing from a larger criminal organization. Sliding in with Brad's duplicate key, Mary moved like a professional thief, smooth, methodical, confident. Years of hitting properties in different states had clearly honed her technique. But what she didn't realize was that underestimating us, as just another pair of suburban pushovers, would cost her everything. Every move she made was being captured, logged, and packaged in a federal-grade evidence that prosecutors could use to dismantle similar fraud rings nationwide. What she thought was just another score was, in fact, a live training case for law enforcement. Her precision as she wired dangerous fire traps proved this was more than fake code violations. It was attempted homicide disguised as property fraud. Willing to risk killing my family just to pad her bank account, Mary revealed exactly why this operation had escalated into a federal matter. My surveillance setup recorded her in real time committing burglary, sabotage, and reckless endangerment. Charges strong enough to carry years of prison time and evidence airtight enough to link her to other organized crews. The moment she finished staging her evidence and headed for her getaway was when our trap sprung. The locks I had re-engineered turned her escape into a dead end, while hidden systems signaled backup that our target was boxed in. Watching her face shift from smug confidence to sheer panic as her key failed was proof she realized she wasn't outsmarting random homeowners. She'd walked straight into a professional sting. Her instinct screamed organized police op, and desperation took over. Instead of making a calculated retreat, she did the one thing real criminals avoid. She dialed 911. Calling for help while standing inside a house she'd just burglarized, surrounded by the very tools of her crime, was a gift to prosecutors. That call, recorded start to finish, locked her intent and guilt into the official record in a way no lawyer could ever spin. Mary tried to flip the story, claiming we were unlawfully imprisoning her. But her own words betrayed her. The dispatcher logged every contradiction, admitting she'd entered without permission, admitting the locks had been changed, fumbling over fake HOA authority. Each sentence tied another knot in her defense strategy. Through my cameras, I watched her dart between exits like a trapped animal, realizing the house had been turned into a containment zone. When her eyes landed on something I'd foolishly forgotten, the plaque on my mantle commending me as chief, her mask slipped. Terror washed over her face. She grabbed her phone again, voice shaking. I need to change my report. The homeowner isn't just a consultant. Send everyone you've got. Ryan was the first officer dispatched. Watching one of my own men roll up to arrest a suspect I had personally boxed into my house was surreal, even by police standards. He approached cautiously, reading the scene, piecing together that the emergency call didn't match the reality on the ground. He saw the frantic woman at the door, claiming victimhood, but also saw the burglary tools, the electrical rigging, the illegal keys. Mary's performance was desperate theater, her last attempt to flip the script. But the contradictions were obvious. She was no trapped homeowner. She was a career criminal cornered in the middle of her own crime scene. Any seasoned officer would have spotted Mary's act as pure deception. Her bogus HOA badge and the nonsensical excuses she gave for why she had authority to plant fire hazards in our home were exactly the kind of obvious lies federal prosecutors love, simple, undeniable evidence of intent to defraud. The moment Ryan stepped into the living room, saw me standing calmly, and heard Mary shrieking about being unlawfully imprisoned, our months-long covert case officially shifted into an open police operation. That pivot meant every move had to be handled with precision. Evidence locked down, procedures airtight, and safety balanced against the volatility of a panicked criminal. Ryan didn't hesitate. He immediately understood he'd walked into the climax of a controlled sting, not a random 911 call. That's what made him one of my most dependable officers. I took the calculated risk of dropping my cover with Mary, revealing just enough of my law enforcement identity to end her scheme while keeping the broader federal investigation under wraps. Ryan, meet my wife Becky, and this is the operation I've been running for 3 months. Watching Mary's face crumble as she realized she'd been outplayed by a professional was deeply satisfying, but there was no time to celebrate. The focus had to stay on securing evidence and locking her down. Ryan adjusted seamlessly, activating his body cam, switching into documentation mode, and treating my living room like an official crime scene. His ability to adapt without losing composure, even while realizing his own chief had been conducting a federal-level operation at his house, showed exactly why I trusted him. Mary's dawning horror, grappling with the fact she'd spent months trying to scam the town's police chief, was almost comical, but also pushed her into unpredictable territory. Cornered criminals are dangerous, and Mary was no exception. Her voice had a pitch that probably set off neighborhood dogs. The police chief. I've been scamming the police chief. You could almost see the math running in her head. Every threat, every lie, every crime suddenly replaying against the backdrop of decades-long prison terms. When her duplicate key failed at the back door, my tactical prep paid off. Her final escape, route slammed shut. That realization hit her like a wall. And yet, instead of surrendering, she spiraled further. Mary tried something so irrational it stunned even Ryan. She lunged at him, grabbing for his cuffs, insisting she was placing me under arrest for trapping her while she was busy installing fire hazards in my home. For prosecutors, moments like that are gold. Physical proof of intent paired with absurd recorded statements. And then came the highlight of the night. In her frenzy, Mary actually snapped the cuffs on herself, chaining her wrist to our front door while screaming, "I live here. This is my house." It took every ounce of professionalism not to laugh. The visual alone, a supposed homeowner locked to someone else's front door, surrounded by burglary tools, was so ridiculous I knew federal prosecutors would show it at training seminars. But absurdity didn't erase the danger. Even cuffed, a desperate suspect can lash out. Ryan and I had to stay sharp, keeping safety first while letting the cameras roll. Her nonstop rambling became one long confession, layered with contradictions that shredded any possible defense. Meanwhile, Ryan documented everything flawlessly: body cam footage, crime scene notes, chain of custody protocols. His meticulous handling turned the chaos into a bulletproof case file, the kind federal attorneys dream about. The result? Months of surveillance, recorded confessions, physical evidence, and cross-jurisdictional intel all stacked together into a prosecution package that would not only put Mary away, but also dismantle the wider network threatening families across state lines. And Brad? The second he realized this was federal, not local, his survival instincts kicked in. He flipped, handing over details about how Mary's crew targeted victims in multiple states. His cooperation wasn't just about saving himself. It gave prosecutors intelligence to protect entire communities from suffering what we had endured. Any seasoned officer would have spotted Mary's act as pure deception. Her bogus HOA badge and the nonsensical excuses she gave for why she had authority to plant fire hazards in our home were exactly the kind of obvious lies federal prosecutors love: simple, undeniable evidence of intent to defraud. The moment Ryan stepped into the living room, saw me standing calmly, and heard Mary shrieking about being unlawfully imprisoned, our months-long covert case officially shifted into an open police operation. That pivot meant every move had to be handled with precision. Evidence locked down, procedures airtight, and safety balanced against the volatility of a panicked criminal. Ryan didn't hesitate. He immediately understood he'd walked into the climax of a controlled sting, not a random 911 call. That's what made him one of my most dependable officers. I took the calculated risk of dropping my cover with Mary, revealing just enough of my law enforcement identity to end her scheme while keeping the broader federal investigation under wraps. Ryan, meet my wife Becky, and this is the operation I've been running for 3 months. Watching Mary's face crumble as she realized she'd been outplayed by a professional was deeply satisfying, but there was no time to celebrate. The focus had to stay on securing evidence and locking her down. Ryan adjusted seamlessly, activating his body cam, switching into documentation mode, and treating my living room like an official crime scene. His ability to adapt without losing composure, even while realizing his own chief had been conducting a federal-level operation out his house, showed exactly why I trusted him. Mary's dawning horror, grappling with the fact she'd spent months trying to scam the town's police chief, was almost comical, but it also pushed her into unpredictable territory. Cornered criminals are dangerous, and Mary was no exception. Her voice at a pitch that probably set off neighborhood dogs. The police chief. I've been scamming the police chief. You could almost see the math running in her head. Every threat, every lie, every crime suddenly replaying against the backdrop of decades-long prison terms. When her duplicate key failed at the back door, my tactical prep paid off. Her final escape, route slammed shut. That realization hit her like a wall. And yet, instead of surrendering, she spiraled further. Mary tried something so irrational it stunned even Ryan. She lunged at him, grabbing for his cuffs, insisting she was placing me under arrest for trapping her while she was busy installing fire hazards in my home. For prosecutors, moments like that are gold. Physical proof of intent paired with absurd recorded statements. And then came the highlight of the night. In her frenzy, Mary actually snapped the cuffs on herself, chaining her wrist to our front door while screaming, "I live here. This is my house." It took every ounce of professionalism not to laugh. The visual alone, a supposed homeowner locked to someone else's front door, surrounded by burglary tools, was so ridiculous I knew federal prosecutors would show it at training seminars. But absurdity didn't erase the danger. Even cuffed, a desperate suspect can lash out. Ryan and I had to stay sharp, keeping safety first while letting the cameras roll. Her nonstop rambling became one long confession, layered with contradictions that shredded any possible defense. Meanwhile, Ryan documented everything flawlessly: body cam footage, crime scene notes, chain of custody protocols. His meticulous handling turned the chaos into a bulletproof case file, the kind federal attorneys dream about. The result? Months of surveillance, recorded confessions, physical evidence, and cross-jurisdictional intel all stacked together into a prosecution package that would not only put Mary away, but also dismantle the wider network threatening families across state lines. And Brad? The second he realized this was federal, not local, his survival instincts kicked in. He flipped, handing over details about how Mary's crew targeted victims in multiple states. His cooperation wasn't just about saving himself. It gave prosecutors intelligence to protect entire communities from suffering what we had endured. Because this had started as a local investigation, Mary's arrest triggered prosecutions that spanned multiple jurisdictions, ensuring her criminal network was dismantled rather than merely relocating to other communities to continue preying on suburban families. The intelligence we'd gathered on her methods, her accomplices, and her operational territories gave law enforcement across the country the tools to recognize and respond to similar schemes. As we processed Mary's apprehension and coordinated with federal agencies for full-scale prosecution, Ryan's radio crackled with news that the case was even bigger than we had imagined. All units confirmed reports of HOA-style fraud in 7 states. Chief Thompson, FBI Task Force requests immediate coordination for interstate organized crime prosecution. Mary's frantic, bitter laughter at the scale of attention her operations had drawn was chilling. You thought this was just your neighborhood? You have no idea what you've uncovered. Drop a comment if you've ever seen criminals fake authority completely implode. It's the kind of story law enforcement can't get enough of. The next morning, FBI agents arrived at our house, turning it into a temporary federal command post. While not exactly how I pictured transitioning from active duty to consulting, it was impressive to witness the coordination. Special Agent Morgan briefed us on the breadth of Mary's criminal enterprise. 7 states, ties to organized crime families, and a systematic exploitation of suburban communities that elevated what looked like petty property fraud into racketeering, conspiracy, and multi-state criminal enterprise charges carrying potentially life sentences. The agents meticulously documented every piece of evidence in our home. Their analysis would not only support prosecutions across jurisdictions, but also serve as a reference for other law enforcement agencies to prevent similar operations elsewhere. Mary's arsenal of falsified violation notices, forgery tools, and intelligence-gathering materials made clear this required federal-level attention. The success of our local operation had provided agencies exactly the kind of thorough evidence that leads to convictions against sophisticated organized crime networks. Her federal charges read like a criminal law textbook: racketeering, conspiracy, interstate fraud, money laundering, criminal enterprise, and systematic exploitation of interstate commerce, ensuring that career criminals faced consequences proportionate to the magnitude of their crimes. Her escalating behavior, fueled by gambling debts tied to organized crime, showed that suburban property scams were funding more serious offenses. Brad's cooperation revealed operations spanning multiple states, victimizing hundreds of families, and generating millions for criminal networks. His detailed testimony helped law enforcement recover restitution for victims while supporting comprehensive prosecution of the entire enterprise. His sentence, 2 years in federal prison with early release eligibility for cooperation, balanced accountability with recognition of the value of his assistance. After federal evidence collection concluded, Becky and I began the delicate process of repairing our marriage. Operational security had strained our relationship for months, but her understanding of why secrecy was essential helped rebuild trust. Accepting that her husband wasn't just a retired police officer, but also a federal consultant handling organized crime, cases required adjustment. But knowing that the secrecy had protected both our family and ongoing investigations created a foundation for renewed confidence. Community response, once neighbors learned the full extent of Mary's scheme, validated our methods. Recovery of losses, $300 for Mrs. Garcia, $800 for Mr. Johnson, and restitution for all other victims, demonstrated solidarity and reinforced neighborhood security. Federal prosecutions returned restitution while dismantling a network that had funneled millions to organized crime families across multiple states. Mary's 15-year sentence reflected both her personal crimes and her leadership role in a systematic criminal operation that caused profound financial and psychological harm. The judge's comments recognized the impact of property crimes on community trust, underlining that organized crime prosecutions must address both social and financial harm. My shift into full-time federal consulting with the Organized Crime Task Force was an unexpected opportunity following retirement. The success of our operation had highlighted capabilities the federal agencies desperately needed to combat sophisticated criminal networks preying on suburban communities. Consulting from home, I could now coordinate with agencies nationwide on property fraud, organized crime, and systematic threats to families and neighborhoods. Becky's adjustment to being married to someone whose work involved ongoing federal investigations was gradual, but necessary to preserve both our relationship and the professional mission I had committed to for decades. Investigating dangerous criminal networks required establishing new protocols for family safety and communication that balanced operational security with marital transparency. Becky's understanding that my work was protecting communities from serious criminal threats helped lay the groundwork for supporting law enforcement careers involving federal coordination. Her active participation in community safety education and victim support programs demonstrated her awareness that effective crime prevention relies on both trained professionals and informed citizens. The neighborhood transformation that followed our shared experience created relationships that were stronger and more security conscious than typical suburban communities. Monthly meetings that once combined social activities with basic crime prevention became hubs for residents to recognize and respond to suspicious behavior. Our collective experience of being deliberately targeted by organized criminals forged solidarity that would provide lasting protection against similar operations while supporting law enforcement in identifying and prosecuting dangerous networks. Ryan's promotion to detective sergeant, based on his performance during the federal investigation, reflected the kind of advancement effective law enforcement leadership should offer to officers who demonstrate competence under pressure. His request to join the organized crime unit demonstrated genuine interest in complex investigations that protect communities from sophisticated criminal threats. His performance during Mary's apprehension had impressed federal agents so much that they requested his participation in similar operations across the region. The federal task force coordination that had supported our local investigation continued with ongoing cases targeting criminal networks using property fraud as a funding mechanism for more serious offenses. My work with Mary's case provided agencies with insights into methods being applied to protect communities far beyond our immediate neighborhood. 3 months after Mary's sentencing, when our lives had stabilized and our marriage had adapted to the realities of federal consulting, a call from Detective Morgan opened new opportunities. Chief Thompson, we need your expertise on similar property fraud operations in 4 additional states. The methods are identical to Mary King's network, and we believe we've identified their replacement organization. Our neighborhood investigation had supplied federal agencies with critical intelligence to combat criminal networks threatening suburban communities nationwide. Reports confirmed coordinated HOA-style fraud across 4 states, matching Mary King's methods precisely. Morgan asked, "Can you coordinate the federal task force response?" What had started as a local investigation transformed my quiet retirement into the most professionally rewarding phase of my law enforcement career. I was now protecting suburban communities across the country from sophisticated criminal networks that local agencies alone could not combat. My consulting work had become a model for law enforcement coordination, addressing both local crime prevention and interstate prosecution. Detective Morgan's briefing made it clear that Mary's prosecution had forced criminal adaptation rather than elimination. Replacement networks were emerging, using the same systematic strategies Mary had developed over years. Our intelligence on criminal methods, victim selection, and operational security allowed federal agencies to intervene early, preventing widespread exploitation of entire communities. Mary's time in federal prison, according to regular updates from the prosecutor, included programs addressing gambling addiction, financial management, and criminal thinking patterns, offering potential legitimate alternatives to her former lifestyle. While her 15-year sentence remained necessary, given the scope and sophistication of her crimes, her compliance with rehabilitation programs and cooperation with ongoing investigations suggested some remorse for the harm she caused hundreds of families. Brad's transformation followed a similar path. His community service evolved into legitimate security consulting, helping families improve home protection while providing lawful income. His probation required ongoing coordination with federal investigators, allowing him to continue supplying intelligence on criminal networks. Brad's journey from criminal accomplice to community security advocate showed that even those once complicit in organized crime could contribute to protecting the very neighborhoods they had once exploited. That demonstrated that some criminals could successfully rehabilitate when given proper support and legitimate opportunities. The neighborhood security programs that emerged from our federal investigation became models for suburban community protection, blending crime prevention education with social activities that strengthen relationships among residents who might otherwise remain isolated. Our monthly meetings combined practical security training with casual gatherings, creating networks that supported effective crime reporting, mutual aid during emergencies, and informed responses to suspicious activity. Becky's leadership in community safety education and victim support developed into a form of expertise now used by federal agencies to train law enforcement officers on the psychological impact of property crime on suburban families and the importance of coordinated community response. Her dual perspective as both a victim and an active participant in a federal investigation offered unique insights that helped agencies develop more effective crime prevention and victim assistance strategies. The lessons from our case extended well beyond our neighborhood, becoming part of training programs for officers tackling organized property fraud nationwide. Mary's systematic criminal methods and the investigative techniques we employed became case studies demonstrating how local law enforcement, community involvement, and federal resources can work together to dismantle sophisticated criminal networks. Ryan's work with the Federal Organized Crime Task Force evolved into specialized expertise in property fraud investigations, enabling law enforcement across the country to identify and prosecute criminal networks before they could establish systematic operations targeting entire communities. His promotion to Federal Task Force Coordinator reflected professional growth I had supported through mentorship and training, proving that investing in officer development yields professionals capable of protecting communities from complex criminal threats. The consulting work that grew from our neighborhood investigation provided federal agencies with the expertise needed to combat organized crime networks using property fraud to fund more serious offenses. This work required travel, careful coordination with law enforcement nationwide, and ongoing family support that balanced professional and personal commitments. Becky's understanding and active support were critical in managing the demands of a career that extended far beyond conventional law enforcement schedules. Reflecting on our journey, from what seemed like simple neighborhood harassment to comprehensive federal prosecution of interstate organized crime, highlighted the importance of professional training, community collaboration, and systematic investigation methods capable of detecting criminal patterns before they escalated or spread beyond local law enforcement capacity. The success of our approach showed that effective crime prevention depends on coordinated efforts between multiple agencies and active community participation while respecting constitutional protections and legal procedures. Detective Morgan's call about new criminal networks in 4 additional states represented an opportunity to apply lessons learned from Mary's case to protect other communities from systematic exploitation. The scope of organized crime using property fraud as a cover for more serious criminal operations continued to surprise federal investigators, revealing links between seemingly unrelated criminal activities across multiple jurisdictions. This latest call wasn't about another case. It was an offer to permanently lead the federal task force that had grown from our neighborhood investigation. Chief Thompson, Detective Morgan said, "We want you to head the new National Suburban Crime Prevention Initiative. Your methods have become the gold standard for protecting communities from organized fraud networks. Sometimes the best career opportunities come from doing the right thing in your own neighborhood. And sometimes protecting your family ends up protecting every other family too. That's how a fake HOA president's failed master key led to the most satisfying arrest of my career.